Hey everyone, this is Lonnie Sanders again, continuing to talk to you about Dr. Laurence Steinberg's book, Age of Opportunity, and some of the main concepts that are in this book. Last time we talked about the plasticity of the brain and that malleability, and about environmental factors and things like that. Today I want to talk about the longest decade. And the longest decade refers to that time period that's been expanding over time, that young people stay in adolescence. And so adolescence begins in biology and it ends in culture, as Dr. Steinberg talks about. And kind of what we mean by that is there are biological factors that start puberty and begin that process. And this can be affected by a lot of things, which we'll talk about later. And it ends in culture. In other words, puberty will end once we go into a stable, maintaining a job, that we are married, or we're in a career and we have children and so forth. So it's when we start doing those mundane everyday tasks, kind of right, the daily routine, and maintain that puberty will end. But the question is, what about what's going on before we get to that point? And so we know that puberty is starting earlier and earlier. And part of this has to do with better food, healthcare, but there's some other factors that we're going to talk about as well today. And so we have to understand a few things. First off, how do we measure puberty? And so typically what we do is we measure average puberty, looking at girls when they start menstruation to the time that they're married, because both of those things are pretty easy to track. Typically, doctors will keep track of menstruation, and then marriage, there's records. For boys, we're looking at testosterone jumps, the voice changes, those kind of things, all the way through marriage. In the mid-19th century, adolescence lasted about 5 years. When we get to 1900, adolescence lasts just a little under 7 years. After 1950, adolescence actually, each decade is going to expand or get longer by an average of 3 to 4 months. And the age of marriage is actually going to rise by about 1 year. So there's a big change that's going on there. And so by 2010, you really have about 15 years from the start of menstruation or early onset puberty until marriage. And then in 2020, that's expected now to be closer to 20 years. So that's a long time period that the brain is plastic, that the brain is able to be malleable and change. And so this is really important. Another way that we can look at for boys that I want to mention is what's called the accident hump. And this is that time period in which boys are more prone to having accidents, things happen to them. And it's because they are more reckless and more aggressive because of the additional testosterone. And that's normal behavior. Some of the things that are concerning is that boys and girls are actually showing signs of puberty as early as kindergarten. 1 in 10 white females will enter into puberty as early as kindergarten, whereas 1/5 of African American girls will. And it's pretty similar statistic for boys who are white versus African American as well. And so that's an interesting thing. Why is that affecting one group more than the other? And we'll look at that a little bit later as well. And so why does this happen? And so it's a mix of genetic and environmental influences. So there are genetic influences, right? Some people are more predisposed to develop earlier than others. You can typically see that effect in families, kind of like you can see, typical heights, typical traits. And so that's genetics. But there's other things that can influence this, and this is environmental influences. And notice when we talked about plasticity, environment affects plasticity and what develops there as well. So the environment has a huge impact. And so simple environmental influences that we already know about is health and nutrition. So people are better fed today than they were at any other time. And so this was the main reason from 1850 to 1950 for the drop in the age of puberty, right? You were healthier, you ate more, that was great. But the current drops are different, and they're a little more concerning because it's affecting our poorest populations, especially inner city children, more than any other group. And so to answer this, to figure this out, Steinberg says that we must know what triggers puberty. And so puberty actually starts in the brain, right? We think of the physical aspects, but it actually starts in the brain. And so what happens is with an increase in the brain of a chemical called kisspeptin. And this stimulates the cascade of a neurochemical process that results in signals being sent throughout the body to the ovaries or the testes, depending male or female, to increase production of either estrogen or testosterone. And this activates our sex drive. These external changes begin to develop. Breasts develop, boys have facial hair, testes drop, those kind of things. And so these changes are physical, but they actually began in the brain. And so the production of kisspeptin is affected by other chemicals, and most importantly, by two that I want to talk about: leptin, which stimulates kisspeptin production, and melatonin, which suppresses it. So leptin is going to stimulate, make more. Melatonin, which is what allows us to sleep, is going to tell it to stop. And so leptin is a protein produced by our fat cells and exists in our bodies proportional to the amount of body fat. So children who have more body fat are more likely to enter puberty earlier. And so this regulates hunger, right? Appetite, suppresses our desire to eat when we're full. And so when we eat diets that are high in fat, when kids have more weight, are overweight, they're more likely to produce more leptin, which stimulates kisspeptin, which pushes puberty to start sooner. Whereas melatonin regulates our sleep cycle. It rises as the day goes, right? As it gets dark, right? It makes us sleepy. By morning, it falls and we wake up. And so melatonin is actually affected by exposure to light. And so these levels are sensitive to artificial light as well as sunlight. So this is very interesting. This is why kids near the equator actually typically undergo puberty earlier, because they're exposed to more sunlight. And so whether it's a screen or natural light, both of these have that impact on melatonin. And so this is why we shouldn't stare at screens, illuminated screens, when we go to bed, cell phones, iPads, all that kind of stuff, because it actually suppresses melatonin production and we don't feel sleepy. So we don't get the rest that we need, which is bad. But it also stops the production of melatonin, so we end up with more kisspeptin. So it's pushing puberty earlier. And this is also why kids today, teenagers and things, are having more sleep-related issues than at any other time. And so obese children and children who spend more time exposed to light will actually go through puberty earlier. Other reasons is there's endocrine disruptors, and these are chemicals that throw off our body's normal hormone functioning. And these are found in things like plastics, which can be found in daily items, dairy, meat, hair care products, and these accelerate puberty as well. And in today's world, this is common to find these in all kinds of products and in people. It's been a huge area of concern in science as they talk about how it's affecting genetics and reproduction and those kind of things. And so another thing is premature babies. So a premature baby with a low birth rate often go through puberty earlier because of the insulin, the overproduction of insulin, which leads to excess weight gain, which we know leads to puberty. Another thing that can create puberty or start puberty earlier is family stress, right? We talked about this with the plastic brain, how stress is more impactful for the adolescent than it is adults. And so families that fight more often, absent fathers, homes where parents and kids feel less close, this increases stress. And so the stress hormone like cortisol interfere with our normal development. An interesting fact is absent dads, right? When we have families with absent dads, often lead to these girls being around males who are not a part of their family, right? Mom's dating or whatever. And so since they're around unrelated males more often, the pheromones can actually trigger sexual development at an earlier age. And so this is another area for concern. And the big issue with this is that early maturers are treated differently. Boys who go through early maturation have an ego boost. They're typically given more leadership roles. They have more opportunities, right, given to them. They take that not just leadership, but that active participant role. They're called on more often to do things. They're often bigger and stronger at a time in which athletic prowess is seen as a great thing, and so they're giving a lot of accolades for that. These guys, boys that start puberty earlier, are typically more successful as adults. Girls, on the other hand, it's tougher. And so typically what happens is the earlier you mature, typically is going to lead to spending more time with older peers, disengage from school, and be more peer oriented. And so because of this, because younger kids who are going through puberty are hanging out because they're more physically developed than their peers, hanging out with someone older than them, they're more likely to do things that they're not mentally ready for. And these older peers are typically more likely to push them into doing things like drink alcohol, do drugs, sexual activity, and these kind of things that they're not prepared for. And so it can really have a huge impact on them. And for girls are more likely to develop depression. They're more likely to have anxiety and panic attacks, eating disorders. Attention from older boys a lot of times is not a positive thing. So it's going to lead to psychological issues and for them making decisions that they're not ready for. And so often they develop psychological disorders and never fully recover from these setbacks. And so these are very concerning. Also, those that enter early puberty increase the risk for cancer, such as breast cancer by 50%, increase in ovarian cancer, metabolic syndromes, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, testicular cancer, obesity. All of these are increased. So early puberty has a lot of drawbacks and can be a challenge. Now, the other side of that is that longer adolescence means delaying adulthood. And if you delay adulthood, then that means that plasticity, that malleability, that ability to change the brain in a positive way is actually longer. So there are some positives to this. And so typically, these kids will, by delaying adulthood, will stay in school longer. They rely on their parents more for financial help. They delay parenthood. They delay marriage. And so this keeps them in that novel stage where their brain is still developing and it's not hit that maturity yet. And so a lot of perspectives see them as lazy, or maybe they're just making rational choices. Maybe the gender roles have changed. The responsibilities are different. And all of those we can talk about and discuss. But the most important thing is for us to understand the positive and negatives, and also how we need to change our expectations. So extended period of plasticity and brain growth and development gives us more opportunity to learn things, to grow, that malleability, to develop positive traits. But at the same time, it also extends that period of unstructured life that elevates the risk with behaviors. And so what we need to do is change our expectations. Quit evaluating children and teens relative to what we were like at that age, because we live in a different world. They live in a different world. We have to adjust our expectations and how we treat them based on their world and what they're exposed to. And by doing this allows us to meet their needs at a much better level, and not just meet their needs, but to find ways to help them prevent some of these negatives that happen. And so hopefully that will help us as we begin to find ways to really help students be successful and to change education to meet their needs at a much higher level. So once again, my name is Laurence Steinberg, and this comes from the book Age of Opportunity by Dr. Laurence Steinberg. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them below, and I'll be glad to answer those or get back with you. You have a great day. Thanks, guys.